This is the Into the Wilderness podcast. I'm your host, Byron Pace, and this is the Science Shorts series. For those of you who have been regular listeners, you already know this, but if you're new, we have a long-form conversation that goes out every 2 weeks, and on the in-between weeks, we deliver this show, which is Science Shorts, where we dig into the science of conservation. Now, if you like these chats that we have in this particular series, then you're going to love the new column, which is on the Modern Huntsman website, which is called Into the Anthropocene. I put it together from articles and stories and papers that I read and source from different scientists around the world and collate them once a month into essential reading. So head over to the Modern Huntsman website and look up the Into the Anthropocene column. You'll be able to read about worms in the Arctic and what that means for climate change, believe it or not, worms in the Arctic, an invasive species, and also what we're talking about today. So the guest that we have on today's show is one of the authors of the paper that I write about in that column. This is a show about the importance of understanding science and the implications of our actions. A couple of months ago, I came across an article in the Guardian newspaper, which led me to a paper which had been published in Global Change Biology entitled "Tree Planting in Organic Soils Does Not Result in Net Carbon Sequestration on a Decadal Timescale." I have to admit, this is one of the aspects of climate change and the climate debate which really fascinates me. In this study, they made use of scientific monitoring plots set up 40 years ago, which were originally being used to look at how native birch colonized and changed ecosystems on heather moorland. Today, these established control plots are being used to understand how trees sequester carbon in these environments, and the results are actually really surprising. I managed to steal a little time from one of the authors, Dr. Nina Friggins, to explain the findings of the research and what that could mean for future policy decisions. She picks up the conversation with the establishment of these historic testing plots.
So the questions that they were asking at the time of planting were different to the questions that we are asking today. They were less concerned about carbon sequestration as a whole, because climate change and carbon was much less of an agenda at that time. But
40 years ago, the landscape has changed quite a lot since then.
Exactly. And but the sites are very unique because they were set up with experimentation in mind. So they were well replicated, and everything was thought of, and there was data from before planting and after planting, and so that it's all very well thought through, which is a huge asset as a scientist coming to it 40 years later. It's wonderful that that's predecessors, the shoulders upon which all of this kind of builds, this research builds, that's been so well set up, because it makes life easier in the long run. And there's a lot of work that goes into maintaining long-term plots like this. It's not just something that that sits there in the background. There is quite a lot of work that goes into maintaining these things, and various people have maintained them over the years, and I'm hugely thankful to everyone involved, really.
As is true of so much science, is it builds on the work done by the people who came before us. So, I mean, that's it's an amazing story that you're now able to use science that was started 40 years ago for kind of a different purpose to tackle one of the really important issues of our lifetime. And can you paint a picture for people? Because, I mean, we've been talking about plots. Just paint a picture of what these look like. Explain exactly where they are in the country. And I'm wondering, were these plots fenced and then planted, or was this natural regeneration of birch?
Yeah, so just to paint the picture here for you, the plots are all in the sort of the north of Scotland, upland areas. Some of them are in the Grampians, some of them are in the Cairngorms, and there's one site which is sort of in Glenafric, which is more west. And the common theme is that they're set in moorland landscapes, so sort of expanses of heather-dominated shrub vegetation And there are also other ericoid shrubs there, sort of woody shrubs, which dominate the landscape. And it's a very common habitat. Moorland habitat is very common in Scotland. It covers about 9 or 10% of land area in Scotland, heather-dominated moorland. So it's a common vegetation type in these upland areas.
Let me just press pause on this for a moment. I think most of you will be aware of what heather is, that short, scrubby bush that turns Scotland's hills iconically a stunning glow of purple in late summer. But did you know that there is more heather moorland in the UK and Republic of Ireland than in the rest of the world combined? In fact, we have about 75% of the world's total. Many areas of heather moorland are recognised as sites of special scientific interest in recognition to their importance for biodiversity. So next time you see a hill clad in heather, you may just look at it a little differently. Okay, back to Nina.
And then the young trees were planted into these plots using a very minimally invasive technique, and that was done on purpose to keep disturbance at a minimum here. And so the young trees were planted directly into the heather moorland in plots that were somewhere between 15 and 20 metres, sort of 20 by 20 metres. So they are, when you look at it from an aerial photography perspective, they look like sort of squares of forest in amongst this purple heather vegetation.
And you were comparing the plots to the landscape literally on the other side of the fence, so that you could get as close a comparison as possible?
Yes and no. So we compared the planted plots to unplanted heather moorland plots, but the control plots, or the unplanted plots, if you were, they were also inside the fence. So imagine a fenced-off area that's much, much bigger, than the plots themselves, and within this fenced-off area, there is between 6 and 12 birch plots and a similar number of replicates of heather plots that are the same size. And so it was important to have them all within the fence so that the fencing didn't, influence our results. That there's no grazing from large herbivores in any of our sites because of the fence.
I suppose that's an important point, that because under normal circumstances outside of a fence, they would either be grazing by deer or sheep. Was that a variable that you've considered going forward as to like how that might affect I know we haven't talked about the results yet, but how grazing pressure might affect results, or if it would at all?
Yeah, it's been brought up several times, and lots of people are interested in looking at the grazing pressures in the uplands. It's quite heavily debated in Scotland how grazing pressures, particularly from sheep, but also an expanding deer population, sort of keeps the regeneration of trees down, and often keeps sort of the heathland vegetation quite low as well. And there are other factors, various fertilization that can occur from grazing and so on. But in a study where you could ask very, very many questions,
yes.
we wanted to focus on quite a specific question and exclude grazing as a variable entirely. That doesn't mean that grazing isn't important in the wider context of this and important for other things, but it was just a slightly different question, and if we wanted to do the best we could with this one question, and get to the bottom of that and really nail those results, and then then other things can be added on with time, looking at grazing pressures, etc.
Yeah. So let's get to that. So what is the question that you were asking, and what did you discover from the research of these plots over time?
So what we were asking with this research was whether planting birch trees onto heather moorlands in Scotland would lead to net ecosystem carbon sequestration. So carbon sequestration in the whole ecosystem, importantly, both above and below ground. And oftentimes, well, there's been a huge amount of focus on tree planting recently as a means for carbon sequestration and a climate change mitigation tool. And we wanted to ask whether this in fact does sequester carbon, because there's a lot of carbon that is to be gained above ground from tree planting, potentially, but it's also important to ask what goes on below ground. Because
is it not true that most of our carbon is actually locked below ground and not above ground?
Globally, soils...
I think that's misunderstood.
It is. Globally, soils store more carbon than all vegetation and the atmosphere combined.
So it's fundamental that we understand exactly what's happening subsurface in terms of sequestering carbon if we want to achieve these targets of taking carbon out of the carbon cycle.
Exactly. Yeah. It's fundamental that we understand the processes that occur below ground, because there is such a potential there for release of carbon. I think that's it. It might be easy to think that carbon in the soil is locked there and will stay there forever, but that's not the case. It is dynamic. It is turning over, and the rates of that turnover will depend on the vegetation that is above it and global temperatures and moisture and other variables. But that can change. It's not that the tap of release and turnover is not fixed at one rate. It is changeable, and we need to understand how can we change it so that we have the least amount of net release of carbon from the soil, and how can we even maybe potentially sequester carbon into the soil.
And this kind of goes to your study, which was looking at a system where there's a lot of carbon already stored in it, and it's a very low energy system, so it takes a very, very long time to put carbon into these peatlands and heather moorlands, and you could lose it fairly quickly if we're thinking about things like fire and burning deep down and subsurface fires, and this idea of looking at tree planting was, how does that affect what would have happened without trees? So what was it that you found? Because when I read the study, I was quite surprised, but it was a question that I had been asking myself very often with these, what seem very often like quite arbitrary targets for tree planting, not really considering where are we putting these trees.
Yeah, no, exactly. So what we found was we had that after 12 years after planting, there was a significant loss of carbon from the soil. So when you compared the heather moorland to the plots that had trees on them, there was a significant loss of carbon from the soil. And this carbon lost from the soil was not compensated for by carbon gained from tree biomass growth. And in the plots that were 39 years old, so trees had been growing there for 39 years, in some cases we saw a significant loss of carbon from the soil still, but at 39 years the carbon gained above ground had offset the carbon lost from the soil. However, there was no net gain of carbon. So at 39 years, you've not lost any carbon, but you've also not gained any carbon.
Interesting. So really the question there, so you're actually taking a hit in the shorter term in terms of your ability to sequester carbon, or what the net gain is, or loss in this case. But in the long term, if it's a net zero sum game, then the real question is, what kind of ecosystem do we want, rather than actually doing it for the benefit of locking carbon in and taking it out of the system?
Yeah, I suppose so. But for me, I also find the timescales of this interesting. And especially if we think about the time scales that are being talked about in terms of, global climates and this, how long, what period of time we have left, in inverted commas, to change our current trajectory in terms of climate change, global temperatures, greenhouse gas emissions, etc. If we're talking about things like in Scotland, for example, the target is net zero by 2045. Well, if after 40 years you've not locked away any carbon, then trees in these ecosystems is not the answer to that question. It doesn't solve that problem in that time scale. It might do over longer time scales, although that would assume that there would be no further loss of carbon from the soil. The reason we think that there is loss of carbon from the soils through tree planting is because these ecosystems have quite low nitrogen. And so the trees need nitrogen to grow, and it's a vital resource for them. And in doing so, in mining the soil for nitrogen, both via the roots, but also the sort of symbiotic fungi that grow with the trees, in mining for this nitrogen, carbon is made more accessible to other microbes as a consequence, and therefore is metabolized and turned over. So the growth of the tree, the nutrients which are required for tree growth, they are also the scavenging and the mining for this nutrient is also what is causing the loss of carbon from the soil. Therefore, as the tree grows bigger, it needs more nitrogen, and therefore you could envisage a situation where there's always, the tree grows bigger, but there's more loss of carbon from the soil, and therefore at no point are you actually sequestering carbon.
It's really fascinating. So it's almost it's injecting energy into the subsurface system and stimulating it into activity. And so you end up with maybe it would be good to just explain soil respiration, because that's what we're talking about here.
Yes. So we're talking soil respiration, which is a cumulative respiration from tree roots that respire, as well as the tree does in darkness, but the tree roots respire as well. But it's also largely made up of microbial respiration, so respiration from bacteria, fungi, archaea in the soil, and they're basically using the bacteria are using carbon which is stored within the soil for growth and metabolism, and they respire CO2 as a byproduct of that, just like humans do.
The results from the study, I find them completely fascinating, but in some ways it's actually quite worrying, because what it shouted at me was, well, maybe we're doing the wrong thing. With the best intentions, we have government incentives that are for tree planting, and particularly here in Scotland, that are probably not going to deliver what they really hoped it would.
Yeah, that there is a potential for that. Although I don't think necessarily that it's all doom and gloom. I think the important thing that these results highlight is that planting trees might not be the best solution in these particular ecosystems. And that's important to stress. We're looking at one ecosystem type here. We're looking at moorlands, which, as you mentioned earlier, have large soil carbon stocks already pre-existing, and it's a very low energy system where things are turning over very slowly. And you then add in the trees, which cranks up the energy, and all of a sudden things are turning over much more quickly. And that's where we end up seeing the results that we see in our study, where there's a loss of carbon from the soil, which isn't compensated for by carbon gained above ground. And so on balance, actually, you're not gaining any carbon. However, in a different ecosystem type, in where there's, for example, much less carbon stored in the soils, planting trees is likely to add, to be able to contribute to significant carbon sequestration above ground, but also potentially carbon sequestration below ground through, litter fall and root exudates and all the sort of things that add carbon to the soil, in a soil where there is capacity to store more carbon and there is not as much carbon to be lost. So I think the really big take-home message, or what our study highlights, is that we need to understand where in the landscape tree planting is best deployed in order to have the maximum climate benefits, and where tree planting can lead to carbon sequestration. And once we know where to plant, then we can, roll out all of our government schemes and all of that in order to get these benefits. But we do need to understand where is best to plant and in what ecological context, because we do risk, as you say, with the best intentions, sort of blanket assuming that its trees are always going to sequester carbon, whereas what our study shows is in some cases actually they don't, at least not for 40 years, which might not be the timescales that we need at this point.
It shows that the knowledge that we gain from scientific study is always evolving. I mean, that is science. And I just hope that we can act fast enough with the new information that comes to hand. I mean, this is a very new study. A lot of the movement for things like tree planting incentives and funding happened in government over many years, and there's a lot of momentum behind them. So I hope that something like this can be reacted to quite quickly. If I can just ask you one last question, just as we bring this to a close, and I realize that this wasn't in the study, but one of the other things that comes to mind, and I kind of alluded to this a little earlier, is that, it's incredibly relevant for what's been happening, particularly over in America and in the Arctic a couple of months ago, is this idea of fire mitigation. And I wonder whether there is a risk analysis that also needs to be done in some of these places where we're looking at replacing a current ecosystem that exists today with this higher above ground biomass of trees and the ability to actually manage that and stop fire. Is that something that we're going to have to understand better as well?
Definitely. As you say, we don't. Currently, there are an unfortunately large number of examples where the destructive powers of fire and the huge amounts of carbon released into the atmosphere through surface burn, but also burning below ground, that those fires, particularly in Siberia currently, are also burning the carbon which is stored below ground, which is huge amounts and potentially catastrophic for global climate. And so if we are going to have these very managed woodlands, if they are going to be planted and managed by humans, then it, to me, makes logical sense to have fire mitigation steps in place. Fire breaks, all these things. Foresters know this stuff. That's not news to them, but it does make sense that we stop and think. I think again that we come back to, if we just want to plant up everything in one big blanket of forest, it might be a wonderful ecosystem for other things, and it's important that I mentioned that there are lots of other benefits from forestry that isn't related to climate or to carbon. There's lots of biodiversity, there's lots of sort of hydrology things that are very beneficial. It creates jobs, it's good for human well-being. There's lots of other benefits, and those benefits shouldn't be ignored. They should still be taken into account. But again, what we were focusing on here was the carbon story. But if you know, if we are going to plant in a managed way, it's important that we understand where to plant in order to gain, have this maximum gain in terms of carbon and climate change mitigation. But as you point out, also it makes sense to put in various steps that mean that if, for example, fire were to rip through, that we have breaks in place and other things. We have the power to do that preemptively rather than being reactionary, which happens in other cases. Of course, those woods are not man-made, and that is why fire breaks don't exist. And that's also important to mention. These are huge areas of forest that have existed there for hundreds of years, and therefore fire breaks, and it's not managed, and therefore that's not a criticism of any management that goes on in Siberia or in California or anywhere else. But if we can design our forests, we might as well design them with mitigation factors like that in place, I think.
Nina, thank you so much for this fascinating insight. It's been great to speak to you today, and I'm looking forward to digging into this more, because it's a topic that has fascinated me for a while, and I hope for people who are listening who haven't really considered this as something which is actually an intriguing topic. It sounds on the surface something that could be quite mundane. How does carbon get sequestered either above ground or below ground? But it's really fundamental actually for the future of humanity and the planet. So it's kind of important as well as fascinating. So thank you very much for your time.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's been a pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you once again for listening. Join me in a week's time when we're going to hear from TV presenter and wildlife enthusiast Nick Baker.